Igor calls us to the Velvet Room again as sleep comes to Ren, congratulating us on taking the first steps to rehabilitation with the forging of the Arcana bonds, encouraging us to form more of them to grow stronger and use them to destroy the palaces, granting us rank 1 of the Full Arcana as well, signifying Ren's bond with Igor in this game as opposed to that of Joker's own personal growth. Yeah, unlike prior Persona games where the Full Arcana represented a protagonist's own personal growth, the main character here, while he is a wild card, is not necessarily represented by the Full Arcana itself. That instead represents Ren's bond with Igor, because as it becomes clear later, he's playing with us. Kamoshida's influence over the school has gotten them to approve a massive rally for the volleyball team, which plays to Ren and Ryuji's benefit as it even more puts on display the heavily injured state all the players are in, and Kamoshida flaunting his abuse of them in plain sight. Him smashing in the face of a kid in Ren's class named Mishima. But moreover, it leaves the class distracted enough for them to go and try to talk to the members of the volleyball team to see if they will come forward. But Ren and Ryuji's poisoned reputation as well as the perception filter preventing any of the normies from conceptualizing the things Kamoshida does as wrong makes this a fruitless endeavor, as everyone already knows about what's happening. The parents, the teachers, most of the victims' friends and other adjacent students. They just can't do anything about it as they are being prevented from realizing that Kamoshida is doing anything wrong. Now this has a point. It is emphasizing explicitly that palace rulers cannot be taken out of power by normal means, as they are being empowered by supernatural forces to literally become above any forms of mundane punishment, or others realize the fact that they are acting criminally to begin with, as the perception filter is preventing anyone that would confront them about their acts from being aware that they need to do so. Thus, supernatural means of confrontation must be taken to shatter this hold they have that normalizes their behavior. I am emphasizing this point as much as I am because there are people who have played and loved this game who still voice criticism towards it that shows they do not understand this point, and how that reflects upon a character arc in the game which is consequently misunderstood. And for the people who ridicule this game, being deliberately blind to this is how they make their entire argument about how unrealistic everyone ignoring these misdeeds is, when they're being mind-screwed to ignore it, and the game, while not being as explicit as I am about it, is showcasing that. But that doesn't mean that the effect is absolute. There are ways around it. It just requires Kamoshida's name and identity not directly come up. This is shown when we next interact with Anne, who Ryuji assumes is a mark for Kamoshida due to the rumors he's spread about them dating that Ryuji mistakenly bought into, causing her to not say what she meant, which was revolving around her trying to get them to not interfere with the volleyball championship, as it would put her own sacrifices to waste. For Kamoshida has forced Anne to be with him, and has been pushing her to go farther into more physical intimacy, sidebar, ew, by threatening An's best friend Shiho, who is a member of the volleyball team, and is actually damn good at the game. But Kamoshida has singled her out for assault in the same way he did to Ryuji and with Mishima earlier, in order to break her. An has been with Kamoshida, as he has been blackmailing her with Shiho's membership on the team, and her refusal to go all the way has in turn led to the violence against her, with Shiho not resisting that assault just so An wouldn't be raped by him. And yes, it does count as rape. Coercing someone into sex through blackmailing, forcing them, or threatening violence upon them or someone else violates consent, as they have forced them to comply. More problematic, however, is the factor of statutory rape, where an underage individual cannot legally consent to sex at all. An's birth date in Apocrypha material is given as November 12th, 1999, and these events occur in April 2016. She's still 16 at this point, and will not turn 17 for 7 months. So it would also be statutory rape by the metric of most Western audiences, as age of consent in many regions is 17 instead of 18. Except when it comes to Japan, for when the game was being made, the national age of consent was 13. Now, before people go into the comments, first of all, that law was finally changed in June of 2023, so the national age of consent is explicitly now 16. Second, all 47 prefectures in Japan, long before this game was made, had already made it illegal for a legal adult to have sex with someone that wasn't either 17 or 18, depending on region, with a few exceptions getting around that law made for those who were in an established relationship or were within a 5-year difference between them. Those laws known as the Seishonen Hogo Ikusei Jorei, or the bylaws for protecting and nurturing adolescents. So say a 18-year-old just entered college student is dating a 16-year-old high schooler, and they might have been dating before the older one graduated. So if they consensually decide to have sex, that is legal because they're within 5 years of each other and have a pre-established relationship, so the older one would not be charged with statutory rape. This is actually smarter in some ways than American laws, where if that same scenario happens, it is by default statutory. Third, the reason that Japan originally had such a low age of consent nationally was due to the country's propensity for arranged marriages, where men were considered of marriageable age from 16 onwards, and women would be put into such wedding arrangements as early as 14. So the age of consent needed to technically be lower, so family heads could begin shopping around for suitable suitors before that point, so the engagement could be formalized at 14. Rarely would the two in such an arrangement marry and consummate their relationship before at bare minimum the bride's 16th birthday, but legally making such an arrangement would instead put them on a path where they would eventually marry, after a point of interaction to ensure compatibility, or in the event that the adults in the family would for some reason die or become indisposed, making sure their children would be capable of joining another family and not just be left to fend for themselves. Unfortunately, those laws' intent wasn't always adhered to, and after World War II began to become abused. Due to the national legislative process in Japan being quite glacial when it comes to any socio-cultural political issues, that's why it took decades longer than the local ordinances were put in place to actually fix statutory rape laws on a national level, and actually impose a penalty to violating them. These violations likewise include coercion clauses, where if someone is coerced into sex and happens to be on that borderline of the age range, like An is, it still by default counts as statutory rape. The problem with this, however, is the individual that is sexually assaulted has to themselves submit the complaint against the individual who is assaulting them before they can be arrested or investigated for it. You can, as a third party or family member, see them being assaulted, but legally you can't file the complaint on the victim's behalf. You could be a police officer yourself and see it happen, hell, you could record it happening, and a court would still throw it out if the victim won't come forward. And fourth, which I am only including here because it comes into play later with Phantom Idiocy, in 1985, the Supreme Court of Japan determined that the laws did not explicitly ban sexual acts between adults and minors, but the only, and I mean only, valid exception to them is in the event the two were in a sincere, committed relationship for a tangibly measurable period of time before the sexual act occurred. The law does specifically forbid, and I quote, acts committed by unfair means that take advantage of the juvenile's mental or physical immaturity, such as enticing, threatening, deceiving, or confusing, as well as acts where the juvenile is treated merely as an object to satisfy one's own sexual desires. They try any of that? Hell, if they try grooming a younger individual to later be a paramour after they're past the age of consent?
Huh?
少年 H 計画は大成功よ
少年 H？
大成功よちなみに光源氏の H や
もしかして先生は6人目のヒロインかもしれないと思った。
Then they're still going to end up a sex offender. It's just in the case of groomers and those they groomed, it's far more difficult to get the victim to actually acknowledge the abuse in order for the abuser to be held accountable. But morally and ethically, they are still on the hook for that, and Japanese media normally does not encourage that. Again, that's one of my tangible complaints about what Code Geass's movie timeline did with the altered Paramour arcs which promoted CC into the role. They changed the story from one that condemned that shit to one that exalted it. But the court decision made allowances and exceptions with intent, once again, for arranged marriages, engagements, or familial approved relationships that may occur over larger than normal age gaps. If the pair are in a loving, caring relationship with the consent of both parties, and if one of them is underage, their family knows about it, then the law has no right to intercede. The second someone declares they were abused by their partner, however, that all goes out the window. But sometimes due to what age they're approached at, the younger one can end up being so indoctrinated to not even realize the damage that's been done, which is the law's greatest flaw and failure by not allowing informed third parties to report on their behalf. But due to the perception filter the palace is creating, neither An nor Shino are acting to break the hold Kamoshida has on them, nor are they communicating what they are doing for the other to make them mutually aware of their suffering, as the perception filter is making them feel like they themselves are at fault for getting into such a situation. Shiho doesn't want An to have sex with Kamoshida any more than An wants Shiho to lose the college scholarship Shiho's starting position on the volleyball team can gain her, as Shiho herself doesn't view herself as having any special talents beyond volleyball. And now Kamoshida's actions have so tainted her enjoyment of it and her general well-being.
おい、あれ
あれ、飛び降りるんじゃ。もう無理。しよう。え？鴨志田？しよう！
And if that weren't bad enough, the game and the Apocryphon very heavily implies, though never outright confirms, that An's final refusal to go all the way with Kamoshida may have made the man replace An with Shiho as his sex doll for the night, leading to the circumstances for why Shiho chose to jump due to how violated she felt. Again, this is never confirmed in anything Atlas has ever put out. It is just as possible Kamoshida just verbally and physically abused her horribly enough that it broke Shiho's spirit outright, so she felt worthless and abandoned and alone enough to consider that last step. As just existing like this, it's not enough to want to make someone even considering it to turn away when they feel revulsion for even being in their own skin. I know that, personally. 16 years ago this November, I was fucking there. For different reasons, for different circumstances, for different extremes of self-loathing, yes. But those differences don't matter to that last step. All that does is the result. I got pulled back. Not by a person, but an experience that nonetheless did the job of talking me down. And Shiho? She didn't have that. But this is the effect of that perception filter at play again, as when you literally can't even think of blaming the person responsible and are aware of no one else doing anything about them, where do you think that's all going to turn? Now, this is made in part worse by a hindsight realization as well, which explains the focused cast's following actions. As the previous day, the protagonist had a chance to intervene on what was likely Shiho's last straw when the two interact after class. But instead, that intervening moment was given to An. Fans had proposed the idea that had Shiho stuck with Ren for the afternoon and then both found An screaming at her phone in a rejection of Kamoshida's demands, it would have blown the whole thing open to both of them, thus preventing this tragedy. They propose it this way as, well, the fandom is fully on Shiho's side as a blameless victim, and there is a vocal part of them that would have liked to have seen Shiho suit up as a phantom thief as well, to rebel against abusers like Kamoshida. But here's the problem with that. As Shiho wasn't actually designed to be a character in the game. She is a story device created specifically to be An's personal women in refrigerators moment and call to action. This scene I just showcased with her interacting with Ren. This is the only time we ever see her in a scene that doesn't involve An. There's literally not enough ground by which to build out her character from that. Oh sure, fanfiction writers can have all the fun they want doing so, but the story of Persona 5 was never meant to dwell on her as deeply as the fandom has. Hell, even An's character story doesn't dwell much on her either. She's merely just there to be a victim, like Ryuji, that shows that Kamoshida cannot be allowed to continue doing as he wants unopposed. As right or wrong it might be to mess with someone in the metaverse, he will only continue to create more victims. And what happened is the last straw for Ryuji, dragging the earlier volleyball victim Mishima aside and confronting him, the other boy admitting to everything, even his own role in being Kamoshida's lackey just so he wouldn't be punished by him as much, leading to Ryuji to once more confront the man, who gloats that with it being unlikely for Shiho to recover, there is no way she'll ever be considered well enough or mentally sound enough to make a statement against him. Which, as I stated before, if Kamoshida had actually assaulted her, regardless of whether it was sexual or not, then the victim of the crime has to make a statement to the police for any charges or arrests to stick. And because Ryuji almost takes a swing at him, it's circumstantial grounds enough for him to lie to the school board and get them expelled. Meaning there are no other options now. We have to collapse his palace and dethrone King Kamoshida. And the means to do such have been provided by Morgana. For palaces crystallize and form around distortions of a person's own desires, with them acting as an anchor maintaining the metaphysical manifestation of the power of the ruler. Get that distorted desire to physically manifest in the palace and then remove it, and it will collapse, taking with it the perception filter that keeps the individual and those around them from realizing their sins. The game referring to such as stealing their hearts. As such is the heart of their distorted desires. However, Morgana warns doing so the wrong way could cause Kamoshida to suffer a mental shutdown in the process. And it's that phrase and the potential consequence which forms the moral and ethical argument at the root of Persona 5, both its story and its discourse. Is it right for the Phantom Thieves to steal away a person's heart, their desires, their natural feelings? Is it wrong to indoctrinate them to act a certain way and force them to live with the guilt of their actions when they are no longer made blind to them? Interfere with something that is natural just to get their way and avoid consequences of their own actions in doing so? Well, here's the thing. This entire debate is based on a false premise, that the palaces are naturally occurring, when they are not. They are being artificially created, the impetus for them being seated in their rulers. Someone is creating them. All of them. And as I inferred when discussing Ryuji's Confidant, the distortions from one consequently have a knock-on effect and can create more depending on whether the potential palace ruler can escape or be removed from the controlled territory of an existing one by them being afflicted by a distortion of their own. So the original individual triggering the distortion to form need not be present or involved at all for more lesser palaces to spawn. And because someone is creating them, or at the very least seeding them to grow, the actions of the Phantom Thieves are neither morally nor ethically wrong, let alone criminal. They're acting to undo the damage someone else unknown to them did, which is only creating more and more victims as the palaces grow in power. The only complication to that being if they accidentally kill the empowered shadow. As if you kill the shadow, it's the same as killing the real person in the end. And that's pretty much the tip-off to Persona fans on what the psychotic breakdowns and mental shutdowns are. Someone in the metaverse is out there screwing with people's shadows, which then affect their real mind and psychological makeup. The outspurts of violence and the palace's formations happening by someone having their perception so distorted they either rage against everything or internalize the emotion created in the distortion. Whereas the mental shutdowns occur when a shadow is incapacitated or outright killed. Ironically, this actually makes Morgana a prime suspect as the actual instigator of, or accomplice to, the incidents as well, since he is a non-human being letting in others to the realm, and one that is suffering from amnesia. He frequently goes off on his own that allows him to move and make contact with individuals we would have no awareness of. Especially suspect because Morgana wants to return to the human form he believes he had before, and not live out the rest of his existence as a cat, only understood by people who've been to the metaverse. The problem with thinking this is, Morgana's Confidant Arcana, the Magician, is an arcana that automatically levels up as you progress through the game, meaning you get his Blood Oath by default regardless of what you do, which would make for poor storytelling if he was the traitor. And if he was the one deliberately causing the shutdowns and breakdowns, then he would not have warned us we could cause one on accident before the confrontation. He'd have just let his fooled companions kill the Shadow outright before vanishing into the Aether, which would have given the game away. But in the rush to now get into the metaverse and take Kamoshida down, Ryuji deflects Ann's desire to help in an unnecessary bit of belligerence from him as, that was her best friend that was just taken away in an ambulance. Affronted, she follows us, which is where the biggest flaw in the Metaverse navigation app comes into play, and not for the last time, as it has an area of effect to it. Everyone inside the specified area is transported into the Metaverse, and Ann was close enough to cross over with us, and follow the group inside Kamoshida's palace.
今度からナビ使うときは気ぃつけねえと。
使う道具のことは確かめとけよ。
And to once more call out Morgana's game-long verbal abuse, how were they supposed to know? This is not intuitive deduction. It's not like they would have known how large that area is, since this has been, the third time they've used the metanav now? And they know nothing about it to have been aware that it wasn't just immediate proximity of a person, nor the time available to test it. But now that they know there is an area of effect, they can use that knowledge in productive ways. Suggesting they do better in the future is one thing, which is exactly what Ryuji is saying. They can't afford to make the same mistakes. That is helpful. That reflects how Ryuji does try to not repeat his screw-ups. What isn't is Morgana shouting at us and insisting we should know something when there was literally no way for us to even have the time to consider it, let alone have the experience to predict the need. The problem that results, though, is even with Ryuji then escorting Ann back to safety, the metanav has also spread to her phone as well. So she triggers it herself and follows us back in, before being immediately captured and taken to King Kamoshida, requiring us to save her. As unfortunately, this exposes Ann as being a complete ditz, unable to grasp that this isn't a normal reality despite having been brought here twice, and already seen something supernatural was going on, but she doesn't grasp she's in danger even when she sees the king walk in with her cognitive doppelganger. But like with Ryuji, the perception filter doesn't work right when the shadow itself is around, due to perception of reality being reality having a lot of stronger effects in the metaverse. Thus, its gloating and taunting and objectification of her as a sex doll likewise allows Ann to throw off its influence, with the breaking point for her being Ann's anger upon learning that her refusal to have sex with him is why he replaced her with Shiho. Again, whether Kamoshida actually raped her is up to player interpretation. It fits the theme of the game and this beginning villain if they did, with how selfish adults in places of power ruin the future of the younger innocent. But that is too far, too fast for some, and a concern regarding game content ratings in the corporate world. So making such ambiguous on whether it did or didn't happen is the best they could do here. But that ultimately is immaterial in comparison to how monstrous Kamoshida is, and how he already cognitively considers so many other women to be part of his harem of sex dolls. But Kamoshida blaming Ann for what he did to Shiho? No, that's not something that's going to fly, even with the perception filter in play. And with your mind focused in rage, does a spark ignite into an inferno.
まったく出番が遅すぎるのよ。お前が立ち向かわないで誰が恨みを晴らしてくれるの？許す気なんて初めからなかった。
聞こえるよ、カルメン。分かった。もう我慢しない。
何も解決できない。分かったのなら力を貸してやれ。
私、あんたなんかが好きにできるほどお安い女じゃないから。
こいつ
潮から全部奪って踏みにじったあんたは許さない。あんたの全てを奪ってやる。
It really is great when the cast members themselves give me the material to work with. For those not in the know, Ann's Japanese voice actress, Nana Mizuki, is primarily a musician, and that was her song Fire Scream from the Symphogear XDU mobile game, where she voices main cast member Tsubasa Kazunari. Ann's our fire elemental and primary spellcaster for the group, with her persona being Carmen, based off of the novel and opera of the same name. Gee, Nana Mizuki drawing power from a musical source. Where have I heard that before? With Carmen herself being a Romani woman that charmed a naive soldier named Jose, who abandons everything he had going for him just to claim the love of Carmen, only to murder her when Carmen herself became mutually infatuated with a matador named Escamillo. Carmen thus represents the fires of passion and a free-spirited woman, one who is constantly being persecuted by the world around her due to her exotic appearance and mannerisms. Also worthy of note that the novel and opera are heavily slanted by pejorative cultural biases against the Romani people, aka gypsies, due to their preference for a nomadic lifestyle adhering to no single nation, and thus not integrating into their cultures when they remain nomadic, despite their nomadic nature, making them be essential seasonal workers and personnel for businesses in every country within which they roamed. The modern equivalent being the entire illegal immigrant or refugee labor thing, where companies rely on them, but right-wing nutjobs and libertarians make idiots think, they're taking our jobs!
They took my job!
They took your job!
When no one but them works the jobs they do in the first place, to just show that such a political talking point is as old as dirt, just directed towards different scapegoats over time. Much of Carmen's criminality of the story thus occurs when someone is openly racist towards her or she is not strictly adherent to the laws of the land due to her being a nomad, and her standing up for herself, such as the inciting act of the story where she threatened a co-worker with a knife, a not uncommon practice at the time in some regions of the world, after she was insulted for being a gypsy. And Jose inadvertently helped her escape from being detained as he was entranced by her beauty when his task was to detain her, leading to him to be fired from his job, which he was about to quit anyways to return home and be part of an arranged marriage. Jose then made a choice to follow Carmen instead when she tries to make amends for the incident, which is in turn misunderstood by Jose as love and seduction on her part when she was just being a free spirit, with the story framing it that Jose was being led astray by her. Hell, the Persona Wiki makes this mistake, like written by someone not familiar with the socio-political content of the story, with that entry saying she twisted the hearts of unsuspecting men to her will when that wasn't what she did. She never forced him to do anything, and it was his own choices that would eventually damn him when she eventually outright tells him that she was never into him romantically. He made his decisions to help her on his own, and her affection for him beyond friendship was all in his head, when he ultimately gives her the ultimatum of bind herself to him in matrimony or die. Carmen throws the ring he handed her away, and he stabs her to death. Some people just do not understand how to take rejection, and modern interpretations of the story have taken to viewing it as one victim blaming a female member of a minority to excuse a man's selfish descent into madness trying to control those they had no right to. But you can see the parallels with Ann and Kamoshida that would make her persona manifest as a representation of this tale, right? Kamoshida becomes infatuated with someone exotic. Ann is of partial European descent, which is a 1% super minority in Japan, and destroys everything he had going for her in a bid to claim her, only for Ann to spike him as she wants nothing to do with him, and only went as far as she did due to him threatening Shiho. But now that that leash is gone, what do you think is going to happen?
行くよカルメン思いっきりやっちゃおうペルソナ踊れカルメンいいぞ
Unfortunately, this confrontation with the king has maxed out his alertness, so we need to get out before he sends all his trapped shadows against us. Ann suffering from post-awakening exhaustion, as Morgana shows he now has a crush on Ann by defending her when Ryuji calls her out for charging in here When she was warned, it was dangerous. This also shows off the double standard that pisses me off about Morgana. As while Ryuji constantly gets both barrels from the cat for any slight, Ann's deliberate idiocy is treated with kid gloves because of the crush. Which either shows once more how much Ryuji's treated as a butt monkey without justification by the game, or Morgana's open, character-damaging double standards and hypocrisy.
混乱して当然さ。いきなりあんな目にあったのに、すぐ理解しろって方が無理だ。
Now play this back to back with Morgana's earlier condescension. Do you get where my problem is? And this is one of the things I'm in conflict with the fandom over, as due to Morgana's constant barbs at Ryuji, players think he is the idiot. He is the problem of this group. Yet when Ann actually admits to her obliviousness constantly, it's a lot more excused because Morgana excuses it. I don't even have that much of an issue with Ann being a flighty idiot ditz and Ryuji making mistakes due to lacking knowledge. But it's Morgana's hypocritical conduct towards them that turns it into an issue, as the one I find to be the problem character in the ensemble. Though Ann herself isn't that enthused by her Phantom Thief attire. While each outfit idealizes the person's own perception of rebellion, it doesn't always reflect their personal tastes. Ann feeling uncomfortable in a skin-tight catsuit due to everything Kamoshida's done to sexualize her. Ren and Ryuji get her out and explain things properly now, with their prior lack of a persona being why they tried to exclude her before, as she wouldn't have been able to help. But now they don't have an excuse not to, and as Morgana said earlier in their attempts at infiltration, they'd need at least a fourth person to properly fight through the palace in order to collapse it and get Kamoshida to confess. But they now only have 2 weeks in which to do it before they will be expelled.
志保だけじゃない。今までしてきたこと全部。もう誰一人あいつのせいで泣かせない。我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、恋愛のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
As a party member, Ann's involvement makes it easier to perform negotiations with shadows, a mechanic I haven't discussed yet as I haven't gotten to combat gameplay yet. In short, you get to hold up staggered shadows to extort money, items, information, or even potentially recruit them as part of Ren's powers as the wild card to join his bestiary of summonable demons and deities. As in comparison to prior games, it becomes far easier to fail to recruit shadows over time. The hold-up and negotiation system ends up annoying me at several points as it just legitimately made it too difficult to recruit shadows I needed to for new persona. Even when I'd rank 10 on story to have all the bonuses to recruitment at my fingertips, a lot of times I'd try it, it would fail. I never had this problem with holding them up for cash or items, but if I wanted them to join Joker's summonable personas, yeah, I had so much difficulty at that. As a consequence, most of my persona recruitment actually came from driving through mementos, we'll get there next video, which by maxing out Ryuji's Confidant allows you to literally turn shadows into roadkill without any battle needed. And as a side bonus to that, if that encounter would have had a new persona, it would automatically be recruited, as long as you have open slots in Joker's supply of masks. To me, it consequently made Ann's special gameplay improvement effectively worthless, with the point of me maxing it out more based on the bonuses doing so give her as a party member. Ann Takamaki's Code Geass character parallel makes her an amalgamation of Millie Ashford and Shirley Finette, with the plot point of Cal and Kozuki's mixed ancestry and attachment to the color red tacked on atop that, taking visual inspiration more from the former, while her personality and personal tragedy is more taken from the latter without the extremes the source characters take things to, making her a social person with a normally upbeat attitude, though with flighty whims normally due to the weakness of her own heart. That does not mean she is indifferent to others' suffering or makes herself unaware of how others normally act, as was the fault of the rooted characters. More that she can find herself oblivious to what others find as obvious. This made the central spotlight of her Confidant story, where it is explored more how she is a teenage model constantly being hazed by her co-workers who are envious of her exotic beauty, which I don't see the appeal of as I have zero attraction to blondes, and her finding less fulfillment at the job thanks to everything that happened with Kamoshida and Shiho. Her having taken the job to begin with thanks to her parents being fashion designers who are constantly away traveling the world in order to keep up with current fashion trends. It's this lack of parental oversight that is also a tenet to Ann's naivete, and, ironically, lack of world experience or cultural integration, with her always being seen not just as the transfer student, but the foreigner, a state that Kamoshida did nothing but bring back and reinforce. But that is how she met Shiho, who has been a lifeline for her ever since, which is what made Ann failing her so thoroughly devastating in the first place. Ann loves Shiho. Some fans believe that love is more than platonic. And that headcanon many players have certainly helped by the number of openly gay and bisexual characters Nana Mizuki has played over time. So with the perception that she herself is weak, it's made it more difficult for her to overcome it, especially now that she no longer has Shiho to rely on due to the other woman's recovery, and the inevitable fact that Shiho just cannot return to Shujin due to the trauma it inflicted upon her. With Ren's assistance, however, she figures out how to best walk on her own, and that is ironically with a direct personal opponent by which to focus herself on. The basis for this inspiration coming from a series she watched as a child, where she admired the resilience of a recurring female villain who never stopped trying to claim what she wanted, but that not crystallizing into her resolve until the end of her storyline when the model who had been hazing her, Mika, reveals herself to be an utter bitch that hadn't just been screwing with her, but all the other models, just to raise her own profile higher than theirs. That selfish malice making something click for Ann, by which to oppose her with everything she has, and make her recognize that Ann is better than her, regardless of what tricks the other model may pull. Admittedly not the best way to deal with someone out to ruin other people's lives, but that's kind of the thing with the role of Ann that also makes her distinct from most of Nana Mizuki's other roles, while playing into the general typecast. A lot of her characters end up abused or traumatized women in some way, either things being done to them or significant loss of someone they were close to, shaping their lives for the worst. Be it Hyuga Hinata and everything with her family, Colette from Tales of Symphonia, where she was being forcibly turned into an angel by a group of assholes so she could be an empty host for another soul, Fate Testarossa from Lyrical Nanoha, where she was a clone of her sister her mom wanted to revive from near death, Angelis Mitsurugi, who was outright dehumanized by her entire society in Croissange, only for her to gain the drive to literally spit in the face of God, Tsubasa Kazunari, who had her girlfriend die in her arms at the start of Symphogear, on top of her sperm donor also being her grandfather. Yeah, go back and watch my Symphogear video for greater context on that. Hell, this happened when Nana voiced Victini for the Pokemon movies, and the king Victini was friends with abusing their power to enhance their forces until Victini got sealed in a bubble so that power wouldn't be used against him. There is a pattern with this, and not helped by the social isolation a lot of these characters suffer from, but is more epitomized by her role as Mocha Akashiya, as, for those who have never read Rosario Vampire, the entire reason that character created an outer personality which sealed off her true self was because she felt isolated from everyone by being herself. That didn't exactly translate well to the more fanservice-focused anime adaptation, whereas the original manga had such be a more essential and thematic plot arc. I kind of feel like Rosario Vampire is one of those manga to anime adaptations that needs a reboot, as the anime, by comparison to the manga's actual plot arc, actually does end up making it trashy. And while that might sound like Ann in its entirety with these comparable roles, again, the difference is tangible in that while these other characters tend to be savants at something, Ann is generally a lot more airheaded than any other character Nana has ever played, which was not helped at all by the localization taking that interpretation up to 11 into being a borderline bimbo at points. Moreover, while the listed characters already have strong resolves or gain them quickly to survive their circumstances, that is not something which comes easily or expediently to An, with An still having faltering steps along that path as she seeks amidst all this to reconcile with Shiho for her role in her trying to kill herself, and help the injured woman through her recovery. A process that does end up lasting the entire year, to more explain why Shiho being a recruitable party member, that was never in the tarot cards.
そっか。
Which brings us to, is An the traitor? As if her heart wavers in the face of authority, could she have turned on Ren? Well, the lover's arcana, on top of what one would expect about love and attraction, tends to be more focused on trials overcome. After all, you have to become seen as worthy by those you wish to be your paramour in order to gain a relationship with them. But the lover's in reverse position, it represents failure, foolish designs, and contrarianism. And certainly someone feels like an idiot when they try to court someone that just wasn't into them. And thus once more we see An start the story on the borderline of the reversal, with her acting foolish in her failure towards her best friend. Only for her to get better as the Confidant story plays itself, and she finds the challenge in her enemy model that will keep her attention focused. And especially because of what happened with Shiho being a consequence of the abuse of the people, like Ryuji and Morgana, she's immediately thrown out as a potential suspect.
昔、志保と会って救われた時にね、思ったの。出会いは宝物。私、もう逃げない。自分にちゃんと向き合って、今度は誰かを救ってあげたい。でも、まだちょっと不安だから、君にも手伝ってほしいな。だから君も私を頼って。なんかようやく君と同じとこに立てた気がする。君と出会えて本当によかった。我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、恋愛の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
However, with going through An's Confidant story, she becomes the first character that the protagonist has the option to romance. And thus, we need to discuss the game's paramour system and the harem ending.
お前、何やらかしたんだよ。店の外にいんの、ありゃもしかして。
昨日電気ついてたよ。恋愛音痴の目ならごまかせると思った？
It is actually possible to confess your affections for and get in a relation with every single female confidant in the game, bar one, at the same time. And while Atlas gives you the freedom to, the company does not deliberately encourage players to go through with it, even writing in a hilarious scene representing the consequences of how betrayed each of these women felt by going behind their backs and not telling any of the others about their relationships. That more than anything else is probably what doomed it to failure. The complete lack of communication and their obliviousness that there were, or they were, the other women in the relationship. Communication is a major requirement for multi-member relationships. Just look at Rex from Xenoblade. He ends up having 3 wives and they made it work as a functioning polycule, as the guy literally cannot tell a lie. This scene is very well written, as you have to match the blood oaths of each member here, which means they completely trust you. And yet this is a massive betrayal on a fundamental level for one to go about doing it. They generally guilt you over it to show there can be no reward in doing so, concluding with them all kicking Ren's ass. And Atlas does not deliberately encourage players to perform the harem ending. They in fact deleted from the game a prototype for a "we're fine with it" route to the harem ending that someone found during data mining. Done so to discourage actually going through with it, as that's actually connected to a bad ending of the game, and I will be discussing it when it is relevant too. However, they nonetheless did make it a requirement to unintentionally to recruit more than one paramour, and that is unfortunately due to game mechanics. As this is a Persona game, there is inevitably a point the game becomes a life simulator for the normal high school experience. Most of your actions being to socialize with specific individuals to form the bonds needed to rank up confidants, gain the special abilities from those confidants, earn money, study for classes, and rank up Ren's personal social stats. Those being knowledge, guts, proficiency, kindness, and charm, with them needed to facilitate all the former actions throughout those days, especially from the confidants that require you have their scores high enough to even begin their stories. For the best chance at defeating the palace rulers and the conspiracy part of creating them, as well as uncover the traitor in your midst, you need to focus on doing everything, everywhere, all at once, as soon as you can. And it actually is possible to 100% everything. Literally everything in the game in one single playthrough of it. It is a micromanagement hell with no free days on the schedule in the event you miss something, but it is doable. But there is one caveat to that. You need to romance multiple women to unlock the right time flow of events to open up new gaps to do things in the late story of the game. And I don't want to romance everyone. Hell, the fact we can romance adults was a big thing the Western fandom complained about because they thought it was encouraging pedophilia, instead of, as I explained earlier, it being a quirk of Japanese laws which permit such as long as the relationship does not involve grooming, deception, or is about solely sex before the age of maturity, and those complaining being ignorant of Ren turning 17 well before any potential bow chicka bow wow could have taken place. And again, several places in even the United States have 17 as an age of consent. It got so bad that people who did not know or understand this created a mod that deliberately stripped out the older women paramour content from the game. In doing so, accusing these older women of taking advantage of the protagonist, and seemed to completely ignore that Ren, after reaching an acknowledged age of consent, came on to them. And you have to talk the older women into it, which in and of itself refutes the claim, and hits that this relationship is not about sex clause in Japanese laws, so yeah, it doesn't encourage pedophilia, you idiots. If you don't want to romance older women, you don't have to romance the older women. It is optional content. Hell, it's optional content which was included explicitly for older players who were uncomfortable romancing younger women, even playing as a teenager, due to the protagonist being stripped down from having a character explicitly to be a player XP. And frankly, I would have rather had Joker be allowed to be a voiced character explicitly because of this problem. And furthermore, why does everyone that slanders the game for this always blame the older women? When again, it's the protagonist, or on behalf of the player, that comes onto them. It's never done the other way around in the entire game. So it seems like they have a problem with women in general, and is using the game as an excuse to voice it, since they deliberately ignore the actual pedophilic rapist that is the game's first enemy, which shows how wrong such is to blackmail one into sex against consent. And An is unfortunately the central linchpin of that. While I found that not every paramour causes this event optimization, she was the first one I couldn't bring myself to do, once again because of the actor illusion issue taking effect. As I've discussed before in previous videos on the Super Robot Wars game franchise, Nana's character of Angelis Ikaruga Mitsurugi is in many respects the spiritual daughter of Lelouch v. Britannia and Callan Kozuki, at least before one of the mobile games actually introduced an actual biological daughter of the two. Due to her sharing the mutual characteristics of the two, how her story writes her growth, and her personal mech bearing many of the same capabilities that Lelouch and Callan's machines did. An shares similar traits again with Ange, albeit with An having her hairstyle more like Ange's paramour Hilda, despite her consequential airheaded mannerisms, and thus romancing An in Persona 5 with Joker, who is already a thematic Lelouch XP thanks to Jun Fukuyama voicing both characters, leads me to having an executive dysfunction that makes me incapable of pulling the paramour trigger with her. But because I didn't, an event doesn't flag at the fastest possible time by which to complete it on an open day like it does if you do court on, meaning you can have several missed days wherein you have to reschedule other events in the timeline, and that could potentially lead to things you need to do you no longer can do. And I only found this out well past the point I completed her blood oath. That spooked me enough that, while I refrained from going full harem, I narrowed it down to the most likely in a real-world sense that could be viable paramour options, and kept those in my playthrough. But realistically, there were only 3 options, 2 of whom were in the core game. Honestly, many fans have pointed out that, if you don't just ship her with Shiho, An gels better with Ryuji anyways, as is showcased through their actions in the game. And Nana and Mamoru's characters have been canonical paramours in the past, to explain why they have such good character chemistry in their voice roles. Though that also gives another reason for why Morgana treats Ryuji so reprehensibly. But An and Ren being an item, yeah, while some fans are for it, it's not one for me. Anyways, back in the now, An is formally joining the Phantom Thieves, with her garnering the pseudonym Panther to complement Ren's Joker and Ryuji's Skull, which makes Morgana just crush on her more. But with us being outclassed 3 trips in a row just inside Kamoshida's palace, it's time to start actually planning and preparing for infiltrations, meaning we need actual proper infiltration supplies, involving healing items, stamina drinks, and better weapons and armor than the makeshift ones we've been able to scrounge up. Which is where this vision of beauty enters the picture, this being tied to Kemi, the local doctor around the corner from Sojiro's cafe, who will give us discounts on healing supplies by helping her out as a test subject in clinical trials she is performing. She is also a confidant, but due to time and completion of such requiring a game mechanic not yet introduced, we're going to leave that until next time. However, Tai cannot supply all the stat rejuvenation items we need. She can give us things that regenerate health and get rid of status ailments, but there's one thing she cannot supply: SP replenishment items. The largest hindrance in this game is Persona 5 introducing a psychological strain mechanic into even being in the metaverse. Which does make sense. Being in a palace as a Phantom Thief means one is actively using their willpower to rebel against the will and whims of the palace ruler, and resisting such psychological attack, even passively, is going to invoke mental and emotional strain on a person. And thus, that is expressed by there being very few ways in the game to recover skill points, as SP relates to mana, and mana to mental willpower. Thus, the only way to replenish those effectively is by giving the characters mental stimulants in the form of soft drinks, energy drinks, and coffee. The irony being, well, Ren lives above a coffee shop, and you are usually too busy doing everything else in the game to just brew batches of coffee up en masse. Plus, Sojiro would notice a large amount of his coffee beans and grounds going missing, and he doesn't exactly trust us enough to touch any of that at this point in the story. You can actually brew coffee at LeBlanc later in the game, after Sojiro himself becomes a confidant, but he has meticulous standards, so while the coffee you brew with him will restore SP to the max, and that is very valuable in the late game. It takes a while to do it, and the time taken will end up using a unit of time. There is a way to get around that and start being able to brew up a good supply without losing those windows of time, but we're not there yet and requires getting 2 different blood oaths, not just Sojiro's. However, I should also mention that when you New Game Plus the game and happen to have completed a blood oath in the first lap, then you can receive a key item from that Confidant that enables you to access some of the bonuses from their Confidant ranks early. And Sojiro's is the ability to always make the best coffee possible, even before you rank him up again. But yeah, the overall problem with this is you cannot just go to a store in this game and buy up large amounts of caffeinated drinks or even something like Gatorade. For some reason. You can only find such SP recovery items by buying them out of the vending machines peppered around the maps of the greater Tokyo region that are unlocked over time. And you can only purchase so many of them at a time before the machines run out or rate limit your purchases. And the developer is doing this so you can't just min-max your way out of the deliberate SP limitations imposed. This makes it so you have to be smart and make wise choices with the mechanics, party rotation so SP isn't depleted by the important characters, and also make as much use out of physical attack skills that burn through HP, as HP recovery items are much easier to stock up on, even if using those physical power attacks increases the risk of depleting a party member's HP due to an attack in the process. Though something to watch out for that I actually missed for a long time in the game, while I found the common vending machines sparsed around the areas that open up, I actually forgot to check around Sojiro's cafe for any. And in fact, one of the best SP drink vending machines in the game is actually at the bathhouse that is across the street from the cafe. It wasn't until late June in the timeline of the game that I found it, meaning I missed out on about 2 months of SP drinks from that machine. Oops. Now, while I said that Tai doesn't have any SP recovery items stocked, that is partially a lie. Upon reaching rank 5 with her Confidant, she begins to sell the accessory item SP Adhesive, which have the special ability Invigorate attached to them, which passively restores skill points to someone equipped with it every turn in battle. However, they are ridiculously expensive, even with the discounts Tai then gives you at her higher ranks for her items, and the SP Adhesive 3 with Invigorate 3 only restores 7 skill points per character turn. That is still helpful for padding our supply of SP, especially early in the game where you don't have a lot of skill points, and even more if you're moderating your use of SP skills so characters can play out battles to implicitly recover stats. But unless you're on New Game Plus, you're not going to be able to afford them at the point they are most useful. Until Persona 5's Royal re-release, that was the only way to get equipment that recovered SP. And worse, while there are also a few Persona that learn Invigorate that Ren can summon, the skill does not stack with the accessory ability. You can have one or the other, but not both. And worst of all, endgame skills for Persona can cost anywhere from 40 to 90 SP per casting, meaning the Invigorate accessories just stop being useful after a point, as while that little bit of SP regain can still help in mid-battle, it's usually wiser to just use the stockpile of items you gather throughout the course of the game, and use them between battles or in safe rooms to recover. If you can get Tai's Confidant ranked early enough to get the discounts, and save the money to buy them in the mid-game to equip them on just the 4 characters you have active in battle, that can allow you to build up the stockpile of SP items you will need to survive battle with the game's end bosses. And yes, end bosses, plural. There are 3 primary villains of this game in the original, with a 4th added in Royal, that are collectively setting in motion the story's events and play part in the conspiracy arc. Though in 5 Royal, you do have another option for SP regeneration, that being the DLC accessed Izanagi no Okami, who in this game is the only Persona with the skill Victory Cry, the passive ability in Persona games that restores health and spirits after every battle. I think they limited it that way because, well, as I discussed in the Persona 4 review, there were players who figured out how to get the Victory Cry ability early from a common monster, and then just created crazy mass fusion trees to get it on everyone thanks to trait inheritance from fusion, which broke the game as you never had to worry about stat regeneration again past that point, and Persona 5 is explicitly trying to not have that occur until you've done everything legitimately the intended way at least once. Izanagi no Okami, when you summon him, is already an endgame persona, so a player summoning him up early one would think is just done to break the game. And it is! In New Game Plus, as Izanagi no Okami is actually made worthless until the endgame for a first lap player, because the persona's unique ability makes it so its stats and abilities are all dependent on how much of your persona compendium you've completed. Because of that, Izanagi no Okami's stats are significantly downgraded if the compendium is not at 100%. To the point that our scene at the start is stronger. Thus, until that book is complete and you've recruited every other persona, there is no point in summoning Izanagi no Okami. And that same is the case with every DLC persona. The only point where it's appropriate to summon them is when you're already in the level range they get summoned at, so as to not make their special skills disrupt the normal gameplay. The developers were that insistent on making you work for SP recovery this time around to explicitly stress and spotlight the themes of the game and how difficult and taxing it can be on one's mental well-being to resist going with the flow in order to do the right thing and be an independent person. As for weapons, there's two ways to go about that beyond just finding them in treasure chests inside palaces. As something to remember for later in the game that is a heavily overlooked narrative detail, every weapon you get in a palace thematically matches that palace. The first is persona itemization. Every persona that can be obtained in the game can be turned into a specific item. Either a skill card which can be used to teach persona-specific skills, which, by the way, makes it very easy to complete the strength arcana that is attached to the twins, since their confidant is completed just by showing them 10 specific persona having 10 specific skills on them, or more prominently, weapons, armor, and accessories for Ren and his teammates. Hell, once you obtain Joker's ultimate persona, that persona, Satanael, can be converted into Joker's best melee weapon, the Paradise Lost. And likewise, the strongest weapons for most of your party can be obtained by itemizing the persona that are unlocked by obtaining blood oaths with many of the other cast members and confidants, thus giving additional utility to completing every entry on Justine and Carolyn's persona compendium. Unfortunately, Satanael specifically is an event persona that you can't create freely until New Game Plus, much as we were locked out from being able to use Izanagi no Okami in a first lap through Persona 4. And before you ask, yes, you can itemize the DLC persona as well. Doing so to Izanagi no Okami does give you an accessory with Invigorate on it, for those who are insistent on getting such an item. However, you could also itemize Arsene immediately to get his weapon Arsene's Cane, which is still a decent stat boost at the time that itemization unlocks. Hell, there's a new mechanic in the Royal version on top of that called the Fusion Alert, where if you try to either fuse or itemize the persona with the twins, it will result in what is done receiving significantly improved stats. Unfortunately, fusion alerts are randomized, and one won't always remember to, or have on hand what would be needed to get the best stat boosts out of it. But like a lot of things in this game, itemization doesn't unlock immediately for a reason, as we are first directed to the mundane way to acquire weapons, which happens to be a airsoft gun shop run by Munehisa Iwai, a potential confidant with a frustrating unlock condition. And it's such an irritating unlock condition that it will likely end up being one of the last ones completed by a player, as it requires a player raise Joker's Guts social stack to rank 4 out of 5, and then talk to him at any time after May 6th in the timeline. If you're trying to stay balanced in social stat rank ups, that can actually end up being a detriment, but likewise making Courage the dump stat can lock off access to other confidant acquisitions and rank ups as well. Though if you go through Tai's confidants early enough, you can end up getting bonus points to Guts. And as that's the first one that isn't a party member which you can unlock, it makes sense to start on that early. We'll talk about her next time. It actually is a bit easy to do though, as some of that can be done through other collectible events you might as well get out of the way early. Such as reading books and watching rentable movies on a cheap TV one can buy at one of the used junk stores. It's just about knowing when to do it, as early in the game, the timing just isn't right for a lot of the confidants to unlock. So building up social stats helps in speeding the rest along, until the point they can auto-level on their own, instead of it being a game-long thing to rank them up. But yeah, as I kind of skipped over the battle mechanics entirely, there was one thing that caught everyone's attention immediately as the battle tutorial started up. And that being... gun! On top of normal attacks and Persona-derived heavy damage and magics, Persona 5 introduced the gun skill, each party member having their own type of gun they make use of, in the event that their normal attacks might be useless to a certain enemy.
You know, just once I'd like to meet an alien menace that wasn't immune to bullets.
And as the Doctor Who clip implies, there is no enemy in the game that is resistant to guns, due to the metaverse's existence relying on human cognition and consciousness, and the popular perception of guns, outside of America's right-wing nutjobs, is that they are tools of death. You shoot things with a gun, and they die. Thus no, there is a reason no one has gun resistance. Hell, some enemies have them as an explicit weakness. But there is a reasonable and logical limitation to the mechanic, one that was worse in Persona 5 Original, but is much improved in Royal. In the original Persona 5, you specifically had a limited supply of ammo that you would use up with every shot of each of the guns in the game, just like one would in real life. And you would not be able to refill such while one remained in the metaverse. So if you sprayed and prayed your ammo, you'd lose that as a resource in the event you ran into something you couldn't deal with. You only unlock the ability to create reserve ammo packs on July 25th, when the Magician Confidant with Morgana automatically levels up to reach rank 6, and he teaches Joker on how to create thief tools for helping with palace raids. However, this ended up being a problem, as you can create only so many thief tools that the bullet mechanic itself was creating a problematic detraction, as players became too reliant on it instead of any other more useful tools for infiltrations, such as constructing lockpicks that are needed to unlock treasure chests or exclusive items that can only be found in the palaces. And since the entire point of the infiltrations is to collapse the palaces, if you miss a treasure chest, then it is just gone after you're done in there. But wait! Couldn't the protagonist just buy the ammo? That would solve the problem! No! This is Japan! Persona games are heavily based around Japanese life simulation, just with a layer of the supernatural placed on top of it. And because the political conspiracy plot is the entire framing of the game, Japan's laws are still in effect for a lot of things like this, even if our actions are skirting around the edges of them. Thus, do you have any idea how strict the gun laws are in the country? You have to do paperwork, extensive paperwork, for every single step in which you use a gun. Every single bullet is registered with its own serial number, and one is legally required to return all expended shell casings and account for, as well as document, the circumstances of their use to prevent them from even possibly being used in a mass shooting. And that legal red tape is what so discourages misuse of them. Hell, that's why the majority of instances of mass murder are limited to a guy with a truck and a knife, or homemade bombs that take such effort to do, they're easily traced back to their perpetrators. Weapon regulations are also why you and Yosuke were detained by police when Yosuke showed off in public the weapons he bought for them to use in that game. There's significant enough public threat by just open carrying them for an officer to warrant intervening, regardless of intent. So there is franchise-wide narrative consistency on this as well. And even the means of manufacturing the bullets in homemade circumstances by hobbyists is heavily regulated, so anyone doing it is a known factor. So it actually stretches credulity that even Joker could make the spare ammo packs to begin with. Besides that point entirely, those bullets wouldn't even work with the guns to begin with. Do you know why?
It's a fake.
Every gun you buy in the real world is just an airsoft gun that UI customizes to look real. Thus, making bullets for them is pointless. It only appears to work in the metaverse, because due to them looking so real, the enemies we face think these fake guns are the genuine articles. And thus, because the metaverse works off of rules of perception and cognition, I think, therefore I am, I think it is real, so it is real, and thus the fake guns then act like real guns. But this is why the gun mechanics were entirely changed in Persona 5, as either someone on the development team or possibly even a fan asked a very smart question. How do the enemies we are fighting know how many rounds of ammo we have on us or in our weapons?
How did you know about the parts you weren't there for?
They can't. They can only assume our weapons are fully loaded to begin with, in the same way that anyone has a gun pointed at them will also assume that it is fully loaded as well. That makes such part of the collective unconsciousness, and thus the metaverse makes that assumption real. And thus, in Royal, the gun mechanics were changed so that your ammo fully restocks at the beginning of each fight. As how are these new shadows supposed to know that he didn't just restock them when no one was looking? Which in turn gets around the logical fallacy of how you load a real bullet into airsoft guns, let alone deal with the issues regarding different calibers of bullets being required for different types of guns. A shotgun can't use the same ammo as a revolver or magnum after all, let alone Haru's grenade launcher. Thus, why removing bullets actually helped the game make more sense, and better highlight how perception in the metaverse helped redefine reality. Hell, it actually makes even more retroactive sense when you consider Naoto Shiragane's primary non-Persona weapon in Persona 4 was a gun as well, and she is never shown reloading that thing either. The consequence of removing the spare ammo packs is, due to game balance reasons, the developers reduced the maximum ammo capacity of each weapon so the guns would not suffer the same spray and pray issues Persona 5 standard players would walk themselves into, where they ignored learning everything else, which allowed better highlight of the game's intended focus mechanics by not tricking those who didn't use everything possible into being reliant on it. And consequently, by guns having less assumed importance, it didn't cause players to try and speed through Iwai's Confidant the second one could unlock his various weapon customizations that become available as you obtain his Blood Oath, as trying to max out his first is one of several easy ways one can screw over their own save file. Anyways, as we're making preparations, Kamoshida himself is not staying idle, already sowing more rumors to seed the idea among the teachers that Ren and Ryuji deserve to be expelled, leading to Kawakami pulling us out of class to have a chat about just that, as she's trying in her own way to warn us unaware of Kamoshida's intentions. Though in Royal's version of these, we also cross paths with another classmate, Yoshizawa, that Kamoshida is planning on sinking his metaphorical fangs, and literal other parts, into, as having encountered her a few times before. Sumi, as I will refer to her as, will also be relevant as a confidant later, but we'll get to it when we get to it. But despite confrontations like this, it is still better to not rush into completing a palace the second you enter, as if you prepare correctly, you can rush completion of a palace in one straight swoop, as you have to enter each of them a minimum of 2 times. Technically 3, as the first infiltration, like the ones we've already seen, almost always end up being a scripted story event. The first time is a normal infiltration to get the treasure, and the second time by making the palace ruler aware they are being raided, which will make the cognition of the palace even aware of the treasure to begin with, by which to manifest it. This, I believe, is another sign of the artificial nature of the palaces, where even the ruler is unaware of the distortion that maintains their existence. Thus, when we finally infiltrate, we get access to the majority of the mechanics I've skipped over, including in those being Persona Fusion, which, as the Velvet Room is a jail in this version, the fusion of 2 incarnations of oneself into a single alternate self involves a literal execution. You are literally killing off parts of yourself in order to gain more power. There's a metaphor here somewhere. But the game actually calls out how, as was suspected in prior Persona games, the other members of the cast cannot see the protagonist's actions interacting with the Velvet Room, which is a cool detail. At least until a point later in the game where their meeting finally comes about. But yes, after 2 long videos on this, I finally get down to the actual palace infiltrations. And they are legitimately the best things ever. Unlike the winding hallways of Persona 4's dungeons or the randomized crawls through Persona 3, the palaces are a deliberate progression maze with hidden items, artifacts, and shadows you have to stealthily sneak up on to not alert the palace ruler to something being wrong, with you having to take every advantage you can find and exploit the hell out of it. Each of the palaces is well thought out and memorable, making up for you not being able to replay them outside of New Game Plus. These are stealth gameplay mechanics that I actually adore, as under normal circumstances, I've not been a fan with how they've been implemented in other games I've played or been a fan of, where the jank of the controls often screws with them, or the enemy group's awareness is just set a bit too high. But that's not the case in Persona 5, where if you screw up and a shadow is alerted to your presence when you didn't want them to be, it's legitimately on you as you weren't doing the stealth mechanics right, even though the game doesn't give you all of them immediately, such as the zipline Joker later gets in this stage.
Grappling hook!
Or the third eye ability he gets from Igor that allows him to discern special trinkets and progression items that might be hidden either behind a false panel or in plain sight, which gets you to learn what you need to so you'll be ready for more after you've spent appropriate time learning the prior mechanics naturally. Moreover, you're not forced to just run everything at once with no means of rest, as there are points where the palace ruler's cognition wavers over their territory, usually areas that are seen as beneath that individual to visit so they're not as aware of them. Thus these become safe rooms, where shadows won't attack, as if the ruler isn't aware of them, then neither will the shadows they've dominated. But a person who is rebelling with their own will can see and interact with them just fine. Here you can save and use healing items that can't be used in battle or on the run, which can cost less to buy, but are more limited in utility if you're not remembering to regularly use them in safe rooms. Plus, these rooms trigger more cast interactions and how they're feeling about, well, anything going on, which always is nice to see in games that encourage such engagement. Now, some have criticized the game as just dressing up a hallway, and it's no different than Persona 4, or even at the most extreme, the levels of Final Hallway 13. And my counter-argument to that is, we're trying to find something in a labyrinth where there's deliberate false doors, puzzles we need to complete to enable progression, unique traps and encounters, and even secret rooms that feature stage-specific and special bosses that can only be accessed by finding hidden will seed key items hidden across the entire palace, which makes investigating everything essential. Not every game is going to be Xenoblade or Legends of Zelda, with a massive overworld. Sometimes less is more. And I feel like I get more out of this as I'm actually getting an opportunity to do shit here, instead of being led by my nose and the game holding my hand just to lead me to the only path of progression available that only leads to a door that runs to just another hallway, as was the problem with the 13s. It has been 10 years since I published my review of Lightning Returns, and the criticisms against that series are still relevant as counterarguments to ridiculous accusations of far better ones, as this game does exploration so very much right for those of us that struggle to figure out what to do in expansive overworlds. Though not everything here is roses, which brings us back to a discussion I've been dodging for 2 hours now, the actual battle system. And, it's alright. It's basically the same as Persona 4's, albeit with the gun mechanic diversifying your choices between a normal attack, magic attack, or healing skill that costs SP or physical skills that cost HP. And now you get special animations from all-out attacks that succeed in defeating all enemies after you knock an entire set of them down. Plus the animation of everything never feels like it runs slowly, so one doesn't really feel any wasted time as one might were this an active time battle system. It's stylish and fine, but still ends up limited in a lot of ways just due to things you can't do that a lot of other turn-based RPGs keep as more standard options. At least until you start filling in the confidants, which improve things immensely, which is more where it began to click with me. Such as when one character is hit with a status ailment or knocked down, and a party member at the right rank can undo it or pick them back up without wasting an action. That's very useful. We knock down one enemy by hitting their elemental weakness, only to then pass battle over to another member of the party, which at the right level, and right ranking, can increase their damage. There's a minigame that you can do later in the game to improve that even more. You can't swap party members in battle until you do a certain confidant later. And these are tangible improvements that do encourage filling out the social link system. But the legitimate criticism of that is, did they really need to be sectioned off into social links to begin with? As a lot of this is just standard to well-developed games to begin with. so that they aren't here and you have to be rewarded with them is strange, as if they were being done when such quality of life improvements were first being introduced, instead of them becoming common before Persona 3 even released, yet both Persona 3 and 4 lack these essentials themselves. But a positive improvement is the Disaster Shadow mechanic, where randomly you can encounter a purple glowing shadow that does heavy counter damage to you if you don't kill it in one go. And when you do kill it, it spreads the damage it took in its final blow to the other shadows. So if you one-shot kill it, you instantly kill whatever shadows came with it. I actually like this, as well it can be dangerous if you don't have the right types of elements to encounter the Disaster Shadow's weaknesses. If you develop your party and Joker's persona correctly, it'll never be a major issue. And once we've secured a route to a palace's treasure and looted it of everything valuable, all that's left is to force the palace's true treasure to manifest, which can only be done in the gentlemanly thief way of warning the person that a treasure is to be stolen from them. And to do so, Ryuji himself decides to write a calling card.
なんで
なんでって、なんでだよ。
Oh, come on, I had to at least get one more of those in. But because Ryuji is not a cultured person, and the fact they've never done this before, the resultant message is rough, and thrown up publicly as if to announce to the world, "We are here!" instead of trying to do it privately. And to be fair to Ryuji, this wasn't exactly considered a repeatable gig. The goal of the start was to just deal with an abuser who is given supernatural immunity from punishment as no one could perceive him being in the wrong. And thus the public callouts in that context make sense, as such a declaration would make the Shadow Self feel humiliated and take the matter seriously. And it does. King Kamoshida taking possession of normal Kamoshida's body in the real world to show just how much power a palace ruler has to break the rules of existence completely to emerge like that. Shadows and Persona normally can't do that. This thus acting is another sign that leaving these palaces active is a bad thing, if the distortions can become so severe that they can overwrite reality. And oh my yes, that is a major plot point revolving around those who are actually all pulling the strings. Like, just think about that for a second. It took the actual incarnation of deities in Persona 4 the better part of a year to build up enough power to start punching holes in reality and bleed through their power onto the streets of Inaba. And the only reason why palace rulers aren't doing this casually is solely because they're hoarding their power for the explicit purpose of maintaining passive mental manipulation. It is a difference between brute force and subtle infiltration. Though speaking of which, with the Shadow aware, it forces the group to rush back into the palace to steal the treasure before the ruler can get to it. But as we are repeatedly reminded over the course of the following stages of the game, a confrontation is inevitable specifically because the rulers can't control nearly every facet of their palace, so can immediately warp themselves to their treasures to lie in wait for the perpetrators, taking back their treasure and then invoking its full, true, distorted power as even the Shadow becomes enslaved by the delusion. And with the treasure in his hands, King Kamoshida can use it to evolve into Asmodeus, Demon of Lust. Whew boy, where do I even begin with Asmodeus? As depending on the mythology the creature is from, his origins differ a lot. From being a king of hell, an alternative name for Satan, or the male counterpart and husband to Lilith, the demon queen from which most succubi mythology draw their roots from. And it's this last one that was likely intended, as each of the palaces we raid has its distortion align itself with one of the 7, well, technically 9, deadly sins of man. Lust, vanity, gluttony, wrath, greed, envy, pride, sloth, and despair. Because of the overlap on some of these sins, such as vanity with pride and despair with sloth, they are commonly just merged down to 7. Envy itself also being an odd one out, as it was added to the alignment system in 590 AD by Pope Gregory I, who was also responsible for merging the prior 4 down into 2, despite vanity and pride technically being different things, vanity being appearance, pride being achievement, and sloth and despair having diverse causes for lacking motivation, sloth being tied to ambivalence, or ennui, because you just can't find the will to be motivated, while despair is caring too greatly for something that you can't get over what is felt as a substantial loss, so you are prevented from becoming motivated. Now the thing about the sins is, they're not inherently bad. No, really, they're in their own ways causes for actions. Attraction to things is natural. You want things in yourself to look aesthetically pleasing. You have to eat. It is normal to feel anger when you have been unjustly wronged. Desire to obtain something can motivate you to perform an action to obtain it, and someone possessing something you don't can drive you to seek to earn such yourself. There is nothing wrong with having pride in one's own accomplishments, and likewise there are times when someone needs to rest in order to recover spiritually and mentally, as well as there being appropriate times to mourn or just generally have a negative view of yourself that you struggle through, no fault of your own, to move on from. The problem of where the sin becomes invoked is when someone overindulges in sheer excess of need, or use them as an excuse for one's own actions against others. And likewise, why Pope Gregory tried to simplify the system. It was due to the overlap of the sins. Despair can cause sloth and wrath, or you can feel empty and directionless after you've satiated anger as you have nothing left. Your pride can cause you to become egotistically vain, or envy those who do better at what you're good at than yourself. And you can hoard things that evoke gluttony, lust, and greed quite easily, as the overlap of all three is you want it all. Hell, there is in fact technically a 10th sin known as emptiness, or hollowness, which is different from sloth, as it is a complete absence of, well, empathy, which then causes apathy. You are hollow as a person when you cannot care about others, or care about the world around you beyond yourself. And it is considered the root inciting sin for all the others, because not giving a crap makes it far easier to, and in fact opens the door for indulging in any of the other 9. But what's so scary about being one who symbolizes emptiness is they have a far easier time of just blending into the world in plain sight or invoking the effects of the others in a moment's notice as it suits them. And that is a sin that consequently cannot form a palace because it does not form a distortion. It is the distortion. Again, plot points. And I'm generally surprised no one talks about that. But yeah, the crossover of the sins is one of the fullest in effect with Asmodeus, as it having all manner of drink and meal and gold cutlery and dishware are all evidence of gluttony, greed, and lust's overlap. But because this is our first palace ruler battle, and from the lacking capability to develop the confidence to levels where we can gain the cast's full advantages, it is one of the more difficult of the bosses. Later bosses will have their difficulties tied to their unique tricks, but here it's just because you can't do as much yet, as Asmodeus can heal itself in the same way we can, by indulging in the food and drink in front of him, as if directly taunting the player by him not sharing our gameplay limitations. Though you can destroy his means of regeneration, and in doing so unlock a reason you suck speech delivered by his victims. Beating him requires you lose damage effectiveness even further by sending Morgana off to knock the crown symbolizing the treasure off of Asmodeus' head to ultimately weaken him enough for defeat, which can end up taking time, especially when Asmodeus calls in the cognitions of the ones Kamoshida has had in his thrall. But just stay patient, and the second the crown has come off, Asmodeus goes down. In a panic, the depowered King Kamoshida attempts to flee. The only way out of its panic it sees as an out being jumping from the height of the palace. But he doesn't. Because in the end, Kamoshida is nothing more than a coward, taking what he can because he can never truly earn the right to what he wants himself.
飛び降りる？それともここで
死んでみる。
一思いにとどめさしちまうか。まあ任すぜ。
やめてくれ、頼む、やめてくれ。
みんなあんたにそう言ったんじゃないの。けどあんたは平気で奪ってたんだ。
わかった、俺の負けだ。とどめを刺せよ。そうすれば現実の俺にもとどめを刺せる。勝ったお前らにはその資格がある。ああ！
廃人になられたら罪が証明できなくなる。
And that's part of the ethical and political arguments of the game with the destruction of the palaces. You can't fix society and the wrongs of the world by ignoring the problem, ignoring what distorts it, and allowing those evils to have power over you. To invoke real societal change, you have to confront them, and drag these failings into the light to expose how bad they are. The confessions of the palace rulers play significant parts on that, as they then act to banish the perception filter, and the fallout of those revelations then motivates those formerly trapped by them to act. And from there, it's making sure those who want to restore the corrupt status quo that explicitly enabled this abhorrent behavior, or take charge as the new ruler doing the same, are not allowed the chances to go back on them. And that plays into later arcs in the game to show these aren't just isolated incidents.
負けたら終わりだ。これからどうすればいいんだ。分かった。俺は現実の俺の中に帰ろう。
おいおい、長話してる暇はないぜ。ここはすぐに崩壊する。
死ぬってば。ちょっと。
デブリー
目的地が消去されました。
本当だ、行けなくなってる。
お宝は？
なんだそりゃ。
メダル？あの王冠は？
鴨志田にとっての欲望の源がそれだったってことだ。奴の中じゃこのメダルがパレスで見た王冠くらいの価値ってことだろ。
あの変態野郎、過去の栄光ってのにしがみついてただけってことか。
But we see signs of the shift take place immediately as the palace collapses. Kamoshida going missing from the school as, without his real self also suffering under the perception filter as well, he is also hit with the guilt of all his actions the palace's distortions had obfuscated him from realizing. As said before, the palace rulers are as much the victims of what was made to create the distortions within them that formed the palaces in the first place. But they are not innocent because of it, due to the victims they themselves caused by their own hands. And thus, as Judgment Day comes, the world pays witness to the justice brought by the Phantom Thieves of Heart.
生徒への暴言、部員への体罰、そして女子生徒への性的な嫌がらせ。鈴井志保さんが飛び降りたのは私が原因です。私はこの学校を自分の城のように思っていた。気に入らないというだけの理由で退学を言い渡した生徒もいます。もちろんそれは撤回します。何の罪もない青少年をひどい目に遭わせて本当にすまなかった。私は傲慢で浅はかで恥ずべき人間、いや人間以下だ。死んでお詫びします。私は
逃げるな。志保だって死にたいほどの事件の続きをちゃんと生きてる。あんただけ逃げないで。
その通りだ。全くその通りだ。私はきちんと裁かれ罪を償うべきだ。私は高巻さんにもひどいことをしました。鈴井さんにポジションを与えることを条件に高巻さんに関係までも迫りました。どなたか警察を呼んでくれ。
警察？
マジで？すげえ。朝礼は終了します。解散して。
本当に心が変わっちゃったんだね。
Huh. This event didn't show much spotlight on Ryuji despite him being one of Kamoshida's earliest and longest ridiculed victims. I wonder what he's feeling about this. With Kamoshida dethroned, things will be different here. Not necessarily better due to the principal trying to cover up and downplay Kamoshida's confession, but that's a plot arc for later. At the very least, Kamoshida's various victims can all breathe a sigh of relief that that man is no longer in a place of power, and those enthralled by them consequently also have the spell broken from upon them. The most affected by such being the injured kid from earlier, Mishima, who as said was Kamoshida's unwilling lackey. The banishment of the perception filters more than just allowed him to think straight, it's made him resolve to never let such lead him astray and enable such bullying again.
いいよ、私のことは。鴨志田に志保のこと謝らせてやった。私それだけで